Victorian hospitals were built like machines for curing disease with architecture alone. Towers to vent poisoned air, tunnels to move the dead unseen, and sunrooms built purely to flood patients with light. Florence Nightingale found over 4,000 soldiers died from filthy air at Scutari in 1855, far more than died from wounds, so she rewrote hospital design. Wards 125 feet apart, ceilings 16 feet tall, corridors banished below ground. One hospital, a quarter-mile long, defied her in 1863 and became a scandal. So how did architecture become medicine before doctors knew what caused disease? That question starts at Scutari, the military hospital across the Bosphorus, where Nightingale arrived in November 1854 with a team of nurses to care for the British wounded from the Crimean War. She arrived with a staff of 38 nurses, and by February 1855, the death rate in the wards had reached 42% of admitted patients, a figure the Sanitary Commission's own report later blamed squarely on the building's drains. The building was a converted Turkish barracks, packed corridor to corridor with soldiers lying on bare floors, its wards built directly over blocked and overflowing sewers. Men who survived amputations and bullet wounds went on to die of typhus, cholera, and dysentery, diseases that spread fastest through the foulest air in the building, and soldiers at the time joked bitterly that a man was safer facing Russian guns than recovering in a Scutari ward. By the time a government sanitary commission arrived in 1855 and tore open the drains beneath the wards, flushing out the filth, thousands of soldiers were already dead. She went home in 1856, convinced the building had done the killing as surely as any Russian gun. And in 1859 she published notes on hospitals, turning that conviction into a manual for treating architecture. That conviction rested on a theory nobody today would accept: miasma, the belief that disease traveled inside foul-smelling air rising from sewage, rot, and unwashed bodies. British medicine held this as settled fact through the 1850s and into the 1860s. Doctors judged a ward's danger by its smell, not by anything they could see under a microscope, and hospitals burned vinegar and aromatic herbs between beds. Quarantine was built around this belief, keeping healthy visitors away from a fever ward's air. In 1854, John Snow traced a London cholera outbreak to a single contaminated water pump on Broad Street, removed its handle, and watched new cases stop almost overnight, pointing toward contaminated water rather than bad-smelling air as the real culprit. The Broad Street pump sat at the corner of Broad Street and Cambridge Street in Soho, and Snow's investigation traced 616 cases back to households drawing water within a few hundred yards of it. Even Snow could not say what was in that water, only that it was not the smell doing the damage. Real proof was still decades away. Pasteur and Koch would not confirm germ theory until the 1860s through the 1880s, work that would eventually identify the actual bacteria behind cholera, tuberculosis, and anthrax. Nightingale was building an architectural system on a theory that had the mechanism wrong, and almost by accident, the response right. Getting the response right meant she could turn instinct into exact numbers, and Notes on Hospitals delivered them in 1859. Nightingale codified what became known as the pavilion plan. Long, narrow ward blocks kept apart from each other like ships in a harbor, so that no single building's bad air could drift into the next, and no infection could leap between them. A typical pavilion held around 32 beds arranged in two facing rows, a number small enough that a single nurse could see every patient from the ward's entrance. She set the distance roughly 125 feet between pavilions, or twice the height of the buildings, enough space for foul air to thin out and disperse before it reached another ward. Inside, she demanded 16-foot ceilings, far taller than any domestic room of the period, giving each patient a column of air overhead to dilute whatever the sick room exhaled through the night. Windows had to face each other across the ward for cross-ventilation. Beds had to sit far enough apart that one patient's breath could not settle over the next. And even the width of the connecting corridors was specified, so a stretcher could pass without brushing past a doorway. At the end of each ward, she placed a separate sanitary annex, toilets and sinks walled off and independently ventilated, so that smell from that end of the building never traveled back over a patient's bed. None of it addressed a single actual germ. All of it kept infected air moving, diluting, and escaping, rather than pooling over a sick bed, which turned out to matter more than Nightingale understood. It worked in theory, but the government had already committed to ignoring it. Queen Victoria laid the foundation stone for the Royal Victoria Hospital at Netley in 1856, 3 years before Nightingale's book existed, on a stretch of coastline near Southampton, chosen for its deep water rather than the layout of the wards, so troop ships returning from foreign campaigns could dock and unload casualties directly. The War Office built it as one unbroken block a quarter-mile long, the longest hospital building in the world when it opened in 1863, its facade lined with columns and a domed chapel at its center, designed to look imperial from the water, even if the wards behind that facade breathed badly. Construction cost the War Office roughly £250,000, and the finished building stretched nearly 1,400 feet along the shoreline, with over 100 wards opening off its single corridor. Inside, the hospital was built to hold well over 1,000 patients at once, arranged along that single corridor by specialty, rather than by any concern for how air moved between them. There were no pavilions and no gaps for bad air to escape into. A single spine corridor ran the entire length of the building, with wards opening off it one after another like railway carriages, so that a patient at one end could breathe air that had already passed the length of the whole hospital before it reached him. It was, by the standards Nightingale had just published, a design built to trap exactly what she had spent years trying to disperse. A design built to trap bad air was not going to pass without a fight. Nightingale launched a public campaign against the Netley plans in 1857, before a single ward was finished, and while the foundations were out of the ground. She pressed her case through Sidney Herbert, the Secretary at War, and her closest ally inside government, hoping his office could force a redesign before the walls went any higher. In an 1857 letter to Herbert, she calculated that a soldier in a Netley ward would breathe air already exhaled by 27 other men before it reached a window. She attacked its dark internal corridors, which blocked cross-ventilation and let light reach only a fraction of the wards. And she attacked the sheer scale of the building, arguing that no amount of good intention could ventilate a structure that long. She pointed out that many wards had windows on one side only, with no way to draw air through them, and that the building's drainage ran beneath the same corridor patients would walk. She warned the building would trap the same poisoned air that had killed her soldiers at Scutari, only this time on English soil, in peacetime, with no war to blame for the failure. The War Office listened to none of it. Officials had already committed the funding and the design, and reversing course would have meant admitting the plans were wrong before a single brick had proven it. Construction went ahead as drawn, and Netley rose as a monument to bureaucracy outlasting evidence. Bureaucracy did not win everywhere, and the correction came from a different branch of the same military establishment. In 1865, the Herbert Military Hospital opened at Woolwich, named for the same Sidney Herbert, whose office had failed to stop Netley 8 years earlier, and it is widely credited as the first hospital built to Nightingale's pavilion plan standards, with no compromises made to cost or convenience. Its blocks stood separated across the hillside at Woolwich, arranged so each ward caught daylight and cross breeze from its own angle rather than sharing walls with its neighbor, its wards running the full 16 feet of ceiling height she demanded, and its layout giving every bed access to cross-ventilation rather than a single central spine. Herbert Hospital's 12 pavilion blocks together held around 648 beds, roughly half of Netley's capacity. But Woolwich's garrison surgeons reported markedly lower rates of ward-acquired fever within its first 5 years. Soldiers returning sick and wounded from colonial postings filled its wards within years of opening, the same kind of patients Netley had been built to receive, only now inside a building designed around the air they breathed rather than around how it looked from a passing ship. Where Netley had been built to impress from a distance, Herbert was built to be lived in and recovered in, a working test of a theory that had existed only on paper. It gave Nightingale's ideas something Netley never could, a clean, uncompromised trial run by the same institution that had ignored her a decade earlier. That clean trial paid off 6 years later at St. Thomas Hospital, rebuilt on the Albert Embankment across the river from Parliament and opened in 1871. The rebuilt hospital comprised 8 pavilion blocks stretching nearly a third of a mile along the embankment, funded largely through the Nightingale Fund raised in her name after Crimea. Nightingale shaped the ward layout, angling the beds toward the Thames so that sunlight and river air would wash across every one of them through the day, spreading the wards across several matching pavilions so that from Parliament's windows the whole complex read as a rhythm of blocks rather than one solid mass. Towers rose above the wards, built purely to harness the stack effect. A furnace burning at the base of each shaft heated the air inside it, and as that hot air rose and escaped through the top, it pulled the stale, foul air out of the wards below and up through the shaft, drawing in fresh air through the windows to replace what had just left. Staff had to keep those furnaces fed around the clock for the system to keep working, stoking coal into a fire whose only patient-facing job was moving air nobody could see. No pump moved that air, no fan, nothing but heat and physics doing the work for as long as the furnace burned. These towers held up nothing and sheltered no one. They existed for a purpose, to make the building breathe on its own. Making the building breathe above ground was only half the job. The other half was keeping anything ugly out of sight, and that meant going underground. Whittingham Hospital in Lancashire, opened in 1873, was built over more than 2 miles of service tunnels running beneath its scattered pavilions, brick-vaulted passages lit by gas lamps, wide enough for handcarts and later small rail trolleys to pass through. Whittingham's tunnels connected as many as 30 separate buildings by the 1890s, and workers reported the brick passages stayed a near constant 55 degrees Fahrenheit year-round, cool enough that some sections doubled as informal cold storage for the kitchens. Severall's Hospital in Essex, opened in 1913, went further, threading roughly 3 miles of tunnels through its grounds, enough to connect nearly every building on the site without a single delivery crossing open air near a ward. Coal for the boilers, food for the kitchens, laundry to and from the wash-houses, and the mortuary's own grim traffic all moved through these tunnels unseen, staff pushing carts through corridors that patients upstairs never knew existed. Similar tunnel networks ran beneath dozens of other Victorian asylums and hospitals built on the same model, a design feature so standard that inspectors expected to find one on every large site they visited. The logic was the same Nightingale had applied to the wards. Nothing that might carry infection, or nothing a patient should have to see, was allowed to cross the open ground between one building and the next. The hospital's dirtiest work happened out of the light that was supposedly curing everyone above it. Some patients were never given a window near the rest of the hospital, because the hospital was built to keep them elsewhere. From the 1870s, the Metropolitan Asylums Board built dedicated fever hospitals across London to isolate infectious disease away from general wards, treating scarlet fever, diphtheria, and typhoid as conditions requiring their own separate buildings, and running a fleet of ambulances whose sole job was moving the infected without letting them pass through streets full of the healthy. Smallpox got even harsher treatment because no one trusted a building on land to contain it. Before land-based isolation hospitals existed, London kept its smallpox patients on hospital ships, the Atlas, the Endymion, and the Castalia, moored on the Thames, floating wards that put a river between the disease and the rest of the city. The Metropolitan Asylums Board operated the Atlas, Endymion, and Castalia with a combined capacity of roughly 300 beds by the 1880s, and its river ambulances made thousands of transfers a year without smallpox spreading to their crews. Patients were carried out to them by ambulance steamer and brought back only once they had recovered or not at all. The ships eventually gave way to purpose-built isolation hospitals further downriver, land the board judged distant enough from the city to hold the disease without needing a river in between. It was isolation taken to its logical extreme. If a building on land could not be trusted to hold bad air in, then the hospital would not be on land. Isolation kept disease at a distance, but one more discovery proved that sunlight had been fighting it up close the entire time, inside every ward Nightingale had built. In 1877, Arthur Downes and Thomas Blunt ran a series of experiments exposing bacteria in sealed glass tubes to direct sunlight while keeping identical tubes in shade as a control, and watched the sunlit colonies that should have thrived instead die off within hours while the shaded ones kept growing. Nobody had built St. Thomas' sun-facing wards with that mechanism in mind, because bacteria as a cause of disease was barely understood in 1871, let alone as something sunlight could kill. Nightingale had oriented those wards toward the light because she believed sunlight lifted a patient's spirits and helped drive off bad air, a reasonable guess dressed up as medical certainty. Downes and Blunt turned 2 decades of architectural instinct into proven fact, retroactively validating every ward that had been angled toward a window instead of away from one, and setting the stage for a later generation of sun-drenched sanatoria built to treat tuberculosis with light alone. The sunrooms had been doing real medical work the entire time. Nobody had known why until now. Knowing why did nothing to slow the scale these institutions had already reached. By the 1880s, Whittingham Hospital had grown into something closer to a self-sufficient town than a single medical building. It ran its own farm to feed patients and staff, its own gasworks to light the wards, a railway station to move goods and visitors without touching the surrounding roads, and even a ballroom for staff and recovering patients alike, alongside workshops, staff, cottages, and a chapel that held services for a population larger than most English towns of the period. Staff alone could number in the hundreds at the larger sites, more residents than many of the villages surrounding them, all housed, fed, and kept occupied without a single trip to the nearest town. Nothing about that scale was unique to one hospital. Complexes built on this model, sprawling, self-contained, and self-sufficient, operated by the hundred across Britain by this decade, each one designed so that almost nothing essential had to come from outside its own walls and fences. Every one of them treated the building as a piece of medical equipment in its own right, as essential to a patient's recovery as any drug administered on the ward, worth a farm, a gasworks, and a railway line to keep running as designed. Worth all of that investment, and by this same decade, science caught up with an explanation for why it worked. Pasteur and Koch's germ theory became broadly accepted through the 1880s, settling an argument miasma theory had never been able to win on its own evidence. Bad air did carry disease, exactly as generations of doctors had smelled and feared, but it carried disease by ferrying actual germs suspended within it, tuberculosis bacilli coughed into a crowded ward, or cholera organisms rising off a blocked drain, not through the stench acting as poison. Medical schools began teaching hospital design as applied bacteriology rather than applied common sense, citing Nightingale's wards as proof that good instincts had anticipated good science. Nightingale had built an architectural doctrine on the wrong mechanism and still landed on nearly every correct decision, because separating patients, moving air, and flushing wards with fresh air all happened to remove the same germs that were the real cause, whether or not anyone building the ward could see them. Ventilation worked, isolation worked, distance between wards worked. All of it had been working for the right reason since the day the first pavilion went up, decades before anyone could prove it under a microscope. Proof under a microscope did nothing to save the buildings once medicine no longer needed them built this way. Penicillin entered mass production in the 1940s, giving doctors for the first time a way to kill an infection directly, inside the body, rather than relying on air volume and physical distance to keep it from spreading. Streptomycin followed soon after, doing for tuberculosis what penicillin had done for wound infection, closing the case for institutions built mainly around isolating and airing out the sick rather than treating them chemically. Within a few years, a course of antibiotics could achieve more than a quarter-mile of separated pavilions had. The National Health Service, founded in 1948, shifted its investment towards smaller hospitals built around mechanical ventilation, electric fans, and ducted air handling, doing in a compact building what furnace-driven towers and 125 feet of open ground once did across acres of land. The same shift hit the old asylum sites even harder, as a later move toward community-based care left their farms, ballrooms, and railway sidings serving fewer and fewer patients each year, until entire wings sat empty long before anyone decided to close them. A drug and a fan had accomplished, more reliably and at a fraction of the cost, what an architecture of separation had existed to achieve for nearly a century. An architecture built to last a century does not get to retire quietly, and Netley proved that first. Fire tore through large sections of the Royal Victoria Hospital in 1963, gutting wards that had stood controversially since before Nightingale saw the finished building. The structure that had defied her in 1863 came down for good in 1966, demolished rather than repaired, its quarter-mile facade reduced to rubble and cleared land within a few years. Only its chapel still stands today, inside what is now Royal Victoria Country Park, the single surviving piece of a building once meant to house thousands of casualties, with a small heritage center nearby telling visitors the story of a building most of them never got to see standing. Whittingham Hospital, farm, gasworks, railway station, ballroom and all held on longer, closing only in 1995. It was far from the only one. Many of these former asylum and hospital sites across Britain have since been redeveloped into ordinary housing, their tunnels sealed, their towers gone quiet, their wards converted into bedrooms for people who will never learn why the ceilings above them once had to be exactly 16 feet tall. Bedrooms now stand where the wards once stood, but the lesson those buildings were built to prove never needed the buildings to survive. He first treat he first. Treatment. Long before a single drug could touch a single germ, a well-placed window, a tall ceiling, and 125 feet of open air were already doing the work of medicine, sometimes for the wrong reason, but doing it all the same, saving lives on instinct alone for decades before science could explain why it worked. That is Nightingale's real inheritance, not the farms or the gasworks or even the towers, but the simple, stubborn idea that a building could be a form of treatment, built and rebuilt across a century until medicine outgrew it. If stories like this, where the walls turn out to be the plot, are your kind of thing, stay and subscribe.